Guys, how would you like to use a big boy database for your PowerApps applications? What do I mean by big boy database? Well, I sort of saying that sort of jokingly. Uh, Microsoft Dataverse is actually a SQL Server database underneath the scenes, but it has a lot of features and things that sort of help people that aren't fully well versed in SQL or being a database developer that sort of help you out. That I feel a little limited as a previous full stack developer that I have with SQL Server. Um, and so what I wanted to do was do a step through of creating an app with SQL Server. There are some upsides for using SQL Server instead of Dataverse, even though Dataverse is a SQL Server. I know in the thumbnail I marked out the SharePoint. Everybody would probably agree that Dataverse is better than SharePoint. So I don't think anybody's going to have a problem with that. But the Dataverse, I think I'm going to focus in on why you'd want to use a real SQL Server database over Dataverse. Did you know that if you have a Dataverse database that you can open up Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio and actually connect to that Dataverse with the Management Studio? You can do that. You can connect to it as a read-only database. So if you Google that, maybe I'll do a video on that. That's not what I wanted to focus on here, but while talking about SQL Server and the client tools of looking at data, I thought I'd mention that. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is this is the outline of things that I plan on doing here in this live stream. So we talked a little bit about big boy database. So SQL Server has been the big boy on the block as far as in along the lines of the big enterprise level database systems like Oracle, okay, or Postgres. Postgres is an open source database system, and it's been Microsoft's premier database system. Okay, so that's why I say the big boy. Hopefully, I don't or I didn't offend anybody by calling it the big boy. I was just trying to be funny here, but it is thrilling and exciting to use native SQL Server with PowerApps because a lot of people are just using SharePoint. Probably 70% of people are using SharePoint because they don't have the premium licensing. But if you have the premium licensing and you have SQL Server, you know, what if you have an on-premise SQL server and databases that you need to tie into? Well, you can do that. It doesn't have to be in Azure. You can install what is called a database gateway and connect to those. Okay, so I've done that many times. I prefer an Azure SQL Server database because it's already there in the cloud and you don't have to go through database gateways, and there's additional layers of APIs that you have to go through to work through that gateway. Okay, so what are we going to do here today in this live stream? So I talked about the big boy database and what I mean by that. Why SQL Server? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. What are the big upsides to using SQL Server over Dataverse? Okay, and that sort of goes into what's wrong with Dataverse. And I would say there's really nothing wrong with Dataverse, but you need to pick the appropriate tool for the requirements for your project. Okay, so why we would pick SQL Server over Dataverse? So we'll log into Azure. Okay, so last Saturday we didn't go live on my YouTube channel, but all the accelerator students hopped on to a call last Saturday morning, and we talked about setting up Azure and doing some of these things. But I wanted to actually start building an app with this stuff, like a real app using SQL Server, so everybody can see how it's done, how I do it, how I recommend approaching a project like this. Okay, so we'll go into Azure, set up the SQL. This really won't be a session where I really talk too much about Azure. You could just Google Azure and go and create an account. If there's a big demand for it, maybe I'll create like a little video that will go into that. If anybody, if there's a demand, if people are having trouble with that, maybe I'll just do a little dedicated video on that. But we'll create the database. I'll show you how to do that. and then we'll create our own PowerApps application around that. Now, I've got an idea for an application, which is an onboarding application. Now, if you think about it, there there are a lot of use cases in the business world or even the academic world of why you might need an app to do some type of onboarding. Okay, so if you have employees, you might have, well, any organization will have employees unless you're a sole proprietor, right? So you'll have employees that you want to onboard. So you want to get all their tax information, so you can pay them. You might want them to upload their identification, their proof of citizenship, that type of thing. But perhaps you got some training videos you want them to watch, and you want them to sort of check off. You have completed this. Yes, I've received the handbook. Yes, I've read the handbook. All those type of things. Um, here in my situation, I'm leading an army, a small army of PowerApps developers in the accelerator program, and I want to actually utilize this application for onboarding students. But it's not just onboarding. I want to say onboarding and engagement. Okay, onboarding engagement, maybe even in satisfaction. Okay, so I want to know, I want to onboard my students. I want to keep them engaged. I want to know how they're doing on their projects that I'm helping them with, and then I want to know how happy they are, if there's any topics that they want me to cover and sort of delve into. I want to know if they're having problems, if they're stuck. So I want to schedule a meeting with them, get them unstuck, and make sure they've got plenty of momentum. And do you see Michelle on there? I'll bring Michelle on. And then, so that's what we're going to talk about so far. So guys, Jeff, Nick, Michelle, do you have any questions, comments about what we'll cover today?
Not yet.
Only really the costings of using it, the Azure SQL.
Will I be covering the cost associated?
Yeah.
Is that what the question was? Yeah. Yeah. So I'll actually go through that. While we create the database, you'll see as I change the parameters, let's say the size or even, they call it DTUs, like the resources that are allocated for that database. As we mess with those sliders and change the values, you'll see how expensive that could get. That is one of the, I'll actually put that down here. Why SQL Server? Oh, what about why not to use SQL Server? Okay, so number one is probably the cost. So you think, well, with Dataverse, you have a cost. You got to buy the premium licensing. Okay, so that's going to be $20 a month, right? So I'm talking about costs above that. Okay, with Dataverse, you're, you will have to pay for any usage for that Dataverse, but it's not like the SQL Server like you're about to see. Okay, so I'm going to say cost is probably one of the things. The complexity. Okay. So there is a learning curve. What else do we have here? The complexity. So yeah, there's a big learning curve here. So I'll go in here and say, well, there's maybe when I get there, I'll fill those in. But the complexity, the cost. Let's think of anything else of why we would not want to use SQL Server. Perhaps it's overkill for the requirements. Maybe it's a simple application, and one of the reasons to use SQL Server, in my mind, one of the biggest things that comes to mind is to join tables. Okay, so inside of PowerApps, you cannot do a join like you can in an SQL select statement. And we're actually going to go over some of that. We'll touch on that today, okay? Doing a raw SQL statement, okay? And you can join tables with something called a view, okay? That's a database object. Now, that's different from a Dataverse view. And also, if you think about SharePoint views are they're similar in a little bit of a way that it's not really the data. It's like a query of the data or a subset of the data, but it's actually a database object, and there's syntax to create. So if you really, really, really don't like code, um, then perhaps that might be a reason why not to use SQL Server. It's overkill for the requirements. Um, uh, no desire to learn any more coding. Okay. So in SQL Server, um, there is a language for SQL Server. Okay. You might think, oh, it's SQL. Well, SQL is called, it's an acronym for Structured Query Language. And that is a standard that a lot of relational database systems use. Even something like Microsoft Access, MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, they all use SQL, structured query language. But each of them typically has their own flavor. They like to add on their own extensions, sort of like back in the day where you had all these browsers that would have their own little syntax if you wanted to have something happen in the browser, and it became like this really annoying thing. Not It's not so annoying with these database systems, but they like to implement you know features and things that you can do extra on top of the core of what SQL is. Okay, so in SQL Server, that is called T-SQL, which is Transact SQL. Okay, you know how when we talk about Power Apps, what's the language of Power Apps? Well, it's PowerFX. Okay, so with SQL Server, what's the language of SQL Server? It's T-SQL. Okay, so if you're trying to create trying to Google how to create a query for the view that you might want to create in SQL Server, instead of just saying SQL, you might want to say TSQL, so you'll get the Power Apps flavor of how you would do that in the code. Okay, um, so anyway, let's see here. So why to use SQL Server join tables with the view? That's really big. You can also utilize stored procedures. Okay. But however, you must use our automate flows to execute them. Okay. Just a little caveat there. And that's no big deal. It's easy to do that. Okay. But a stored procedure is TSQL code where you can actually update the code. You can return a result set like you can in the view. You could pass a parameter into a store procedure as a parameter, and it could return something specific to that parameter that you passed in. It's very powerful. And then once you're in a store procedure, you could have user defined functions and all kinds of other things that you have in SQL Server that you don't even have in Power Apps. Okay. Let me give you another example. I was on this project where I was developing an application for teachers. Okay. And it was an application, and all these teachers were on a particular screen at once. And the requirements specified that I was not to allow all these users to go onto the next screen until they all sort of agreed on the answers they were given. So they'd be like on a Zoom call or something, they'd be talking back and forth. And I needed to determine the variance of their answers. Well, I don't have some type of a variance within Power Apps, but I there is a function within T-SQL that I can use. And I came up with a lot of situations on that project where I had to utilize things inside of views that I could use that would return that data. So there is some, and maybe you've got that, you have a function in Excel that you don't have in Power Apps. Check out the T-SQL language. It's a very mature language. I've been working with SQL Server since back in the day before the year 2000. So back when it was 6.5, then 7, and then the next version, which you'd consider version 8, was actually SQL Server 2000. So as you see, the year is 2023. I've been working with SQL Server for quite a while. It's a very seasoned database system. Um, so anyway, I'm just keeping an eye on everything, the private chat and the public chat here. So let's just sort of bring up the comments and stay engaged with everyone here. Okay, so Jay says, looking forward to this. I recently started learning SQL again. Stopped using it due to my work. My workplace uses SharePoint a lot. Yeah, but now I have access to their SQL database, BigQuery. Okay, very good. Um, okay, so here's a question. Data is king. Will Power Apps be able to connect to SQL Developer in the same way as connecting to SQL Server? Now, perhaps what you're talking about there is the developer edition. You could connect to, let's say you install SQL Server Developer Edition on your workstation. Okay. And yes, you could access that. You would just need to install a database gateway on whatever is using the developer edition. Okay. Just keep in mind the developer edition is made free by Microsoft, but it is intended for just developer uses. So if you're going to use it for any type of production purposes, then you might want to, or you would need to legally connect to a different edition. Okay. Is it faster with an Azure SQL Server with Power Apps? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Okay. So let me give you an example in which it is not faster than Dataverse. Okay. And I'm going to include this. Let me just sort of shift things around again. Okay. Very good. This works. And why not to use SQL Server? Dataverse could be faster. Okay. Why could it be faster? Less API layers. Okay. So Dataverse has been designed and developed to be used within the Power Platform. Okay. So there is a chart showing if you use Dataverse over a SQL Server, the amount of API layers, the layers that the application has to go through to get the data. Okay. So with Dataverse, it's right there inside that Power Platform environment. Okay. And so there's fewer calls and it's been designed for that. So you'll find in general the queries will come back faster and there'll be less of a bottleneck with Dataverse in general because it's been designed for it. Okay. Now I say could be faster. It's not always faster. Um, so for example, if you have an application where you got a one-to-many relationship, okay, and you've got a gallery of the one part of the one-to-many, and inside that gallery, you need to display some of the many information. Okay. So you might be tempted inside the gallery to do a filter or a lookup inside that gallery, even though it's Dataverse. Okay. Um, if you're doing any type of queries inside there, it's going to make your application sluggish. Okay. Now, what I would do with SQL Server, especially with a one to many to many, or you've got, let's say, a dozen database tables, and you're going to join them all together and pull them back. Um, that's where SQL Server will really excel. And in that case, it's going to be a lot faster with SQL Server because you're going to do it all there on the server with that view, and you're going to query that view as if it's a data source, and you're going to pull back all that data, and you could have that gallery based on that data that came back from that view. Um, Now, Dataverse does have some native relationships with the lookup columns and stuff, but if you want to do something really complex, SQL Server can handle it. you know, and in really complex situations, SQL Server will be more efficient overall in your application. Okay. So in just straightforward stuff, if you don't have to do a lot of joins, then I would say go with Dataverse. I commonly say, listen, you're creating a PowerApps application. The thing that you always want to be reaching for first, or that you think of first, would be Dataverse because it's been designed for it, right? But if you start getting requirements, oh, no premium licensing, okay, well then you need to start thinking about SharePoint, okay? Um, yeah, I definitely don't recommend Excel. Um, and then if you have a really complex application, SQL Server is going to be your best choice, and in some cases will be faster. Okay. It just depends on the situation. Okay. So, Colin, I've been building views last few days based on your feedback. Not bad once you get into the process. Absolutely. Views are great. They're a great tool. Yeah, so data is king. SQL Server also has a query builder for those that want a SQL statement. Yeah, that's true. And wondering if Power Apps can also connect to no SQL, such as Mongo. I haven't looked into that. I haven't had the need for that. So I wouldn't be able to answer that just here off the top of my head. Um, all right. So looking back here, um, one of the things that I did want to touch on, let's see, why not to use? Okay. Another good reason why to use SQL Server, think about the limitations of Dataverse. There is a one-to-one relationship between a Power Apps environment in a tenant and the Dataverse database, if one has been created for an environment, okay, you can't have multiple Dataverse databases for one environment, okay? So think about this. If you want to have an app that is installed in multiple environments within one tenant, what about multiple environments across many tenants? Let's say you want to sell some software, you're going to install it in all these client environments, but you're going to host all the data and you want that data to span multiple environments. That's when you would want to use SQL Server. Now, what's a little nice about SharePoint is that if you have a SharePoint data source, and if you're all within one tenant, you could have each of those environments. Let's say you install the app in several environments within the tenant. They could all point to the same SharePoint. But if you're in a completely separate organization, completely separate tenant, then that's going to be problematic because a SharePoint site is going to be attached to a tenant. Okay. So it's very flexible from that standpoint. Okay. So let's say multiple. That's a big one, in my opinion. Okay. You've got a lot of flexibility, a lot of power, but with more power, more complexity comes at a cost of having to understand it better. You've got a steeper learning curve. There's a lot more things that you have to think about and do for the solution that maybe Dataverse or SharePoint would do for you. Let me give you an example of that. When you create a SharePoint list, it creates an ID for you. That's an auto number or an identity or y- you know, um, the same thing with Dataverse. It creates a GUID for you. And in both cases, it creates a created, like the date and time stamp of when the thing was created, who created it, when it was last modified, who last modified it. There's all kinds of things that it just throws in there for you, and maybe a lot of times you don't use it. But if you're used to that and you're in SQL Server and you create all your fields and you're using it and you're like, oh, when was that record created? Well, you need to create all those fields yourself. You're given full control, and with great control comes with it great responsibility, right? Isn't that a quote from Spider-Man or some superhero movie? I think it's Spider-Man. Okay. So, any questions and comments, guys, before we sort of jump in and start having fun here? We might come back to this
Nope,
list
I'm ready
here.
to have some fun. Let's
All
go build
right.
it.
Okay. Well, now there's something that I always say to all my accelerator students, and I encourage that in any of these YouTube videos, which is when you start an application, just don't jump into Power Apps. do your planning and design, talk to the stakeholders, make sure you've got all the information, unless you're just trying to open it up and just try to learn and just play around. Okay. Um, I recommend that get a general description of the application. You get all the requirements as far as in the entities, all the database tables you're going to need to create. You'll need to define all the screens, maybe have some wireframes, create user stories, which sort of firm up all the features and who's going to be doing what inside the application. Okay. And I actually had, I think it was 2 Saturdays ago, maybe, where the thumbnail says you're doing it wrong, which is all this stuff that you're not doing before you get into Power Apps. And I talk about that in depth in that. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. I'm actually going to implement some of that stuff. I didn't want this video, this session to be all about that because I've already covered all that. So I did all that pre-work beforehand. Okay. And sometimes doing that can take hours or days, especially when you're working with somebody, a client. They're like, I need an app that onboards my employees. Okay, well, tell me more, please. Well, and you get them to sort of think and go through the business process and all this stuff. And there's a lot of going back and forth and reading the replies and asking them additional questions and a lot of times they're wanting the price and time estimate, and you sort of have to hold them off. It's like, listen, I can't do that until I understand what you need. If you enlist the help of a building contractor, it's like, okay, here's this big plot of land behind my house. I need a building back here. All right, do you need a shed or a skyscraper or a 2-story office building? Well, the requirements for all three of those would be very different, right? So, the same thing with an application. It's like, well, I want a CRM system. Okay, well, you just need something basic to keep track of your customers, or do you need something that will give you all the features that HubSpot would provide for you, which is very extensive. It's an extensive CRM system. That would probably take you years to duplicate all those features with even with Power Apps, probably if it's just one developer. So anyway, so that is important. So I'm going to go through. I didn't want to just jump into Power Apps and not practice what I preach. Okay. What I did was I enlisted the help of Chat GPT. Okay. Um, I'm just keeping an eye on the comments here. So Jeff, can you start building the foundation in SharePoint? Decide to upgrade or move to SQL, or is it design the database just to be different? The database could be very similar. If let's say you were stuck with SharePoint now and you're going to upgrade later, um, the data types are different. Okay, and you're going to see that as I start creating the tables. Okay, so that's one difference. Another difference is if you design your relationships the way that I recommend with SharePoint, not using lookup columns. Lookup columns are good in Dataverse. They're not so great inside of SharePoint. SharePoint's been around for decades. I'd say about 2 decades now. And it wasn't designed to be used within the Power Platform. So those lookup columns have been around for a while and you'll have delegation issues. So I have actually quite a few videos where I show how I do that. And Jeff, you're probably familiar with how I do that in SharePoint. That's actually the way that I handle it in, or how you would handle it in SharePoint. So that's not so much of an issue. So the data types will be different. You could name the database tables exactly the same, which would be helpful if you're going to migrate to SQL Server eventually. I'd say the big thing will be the data types. You're not going to have the database views that you have in SQL Server. So yeah, you could start. Um, I mean, ideally, if you're starting a new project, you're eventually going to go to SQL Server. I wouldn't want to start with SharePoint unless I'm going to be in SharePoint for like a year and then eventually move to SQL Server. And also Andre says, yeah, Spider-Man created lots of SQL databases. That's funny. Um, okay, and also Tim, in the scenario where you have an app that's going to have end users, both internal and external, interacting with the app, are there any benefits of using SQL Server over Dataverse regarding security? This is a good question. Um, what's great about SQL Server, and I should probably reflect this inside my diagram here, or my notes, I should say. I can make these available to you guys later. Something that just came to mind, just how you phrased that question made me think of a reason why SQL Server. What if data needs to be accessed outside the Power Platform? Now, somebody might cringe here because you can use uh, Dataverse outside the Power Platform. I just want to throw that out there. If you Google that, you'll find examples. Let's say if you're an ASP.NET developer and you have some you already have applications that use a SQL Server, um, and then you write some Power Apps and you could tie into that SQL Server. So that's great. Um, but it's more accessible to other systems, I believe, in a SQL Server, 'cause SQL Server's been out for a while. Um, and I think accessing Dataverse, again, you've got more. It sort of reverses the thing where I told you before. If you're doing Power Apps to Dataverse, there's less API calls. Well, the reverse of that is if you're not on the Power Platform, there's probably more API calls that you have to go to access Dataverse, um, than it would be to access the SQL Server. Okay, and that would be a reason why I really like SQL Server. Is if I'm going to build an ASP.NET application or some other type of application, doesn't have to be ASP.NET or .NET. Um, is there's already tools and drivers and things to connect to that directly. Okay, so that's the another reason why I like that. um yeah, so I see so see Power Pages, and that's what so thank you, Nick. That was something else I was going to mention here. Okay, um so with model driven applications, portals, which has now been rebranded by Microsoft as Power Pages. Okay, those two flavors of Power Apps, you're limited to only the Dataverse. Okay, now this is where the Dataverse really is cool because you can create virtual tables in Dataverse that links to SharePoint lists, that links to SQL Server. You can do virtual tables that links to Azure AD. That's already actually set up. There's a in Dataverse. There's a table called AAD users that will allow you to query all the users in your organization that are there within Azure AD. Okay, so you can access that right now, and that is a virtual table that goes right into Azure. Okay, so there's a little bit of a workaround with Dataverse. So you think, or you may know, with model driven and portals, Power Pages, that you're limited to the Dataverse, but you can actually pull in other data sources in as linked tables. Okay, so that's a little thing to sort of keep in mind as well. Okay, so I'm going to reread the question because there are actually two or three things I wanted to unpack here based on that. So I think I'll mention. Okay, could be faster. I think I'll make sure I have this as a bullet point here. You can link other data sources with Dataverse, like SQL Server, SharePoint, even in Excel, believe it or not, um, and Azure AD. And there's probably others, but these are the ones that I know about that have been listed. And that's a feature that probably came out, I don't know, 6 to 10 months ago. So it's relatively new. Maybe not everybody knows about it. Um, okay, in that scenario where you have an app that's going to have both internal and external. So what I was thinking, and thank you, Nick, for bringing that up, where you are thinking about external users. When I hear external users, I'm thinking, oh man, Canvas apps wasn't really created for that. However, portals or Power Pages, that's exactly what that handles. Is an external facing site. It can handle anonymous users, that type of thing. Um, so keep in mind, you can have an external user use your Canvas apps, but they have to be added as an external guest user within your Azure AD. So I'll mention that. Um, are there any benefits to using SQL Server over Dataverse? I think both of those systems have a fairly significant, robust security system, uh, as opposed to like SharePoint, which is more of a basic type of security system. Um, let's see here. Okay, so another comment, data is king. I was looking at the Azure AD user table in Dataverse, and it only has one column for the username and does not have other columns to filter by section, department, etc. Now, there are two tables in Dataverse. There is a users table, which are all the users that have been added to that environment. And then there is an AAD users table that is that virtual table into Azure AD. Okay. And they have different columns. And that link table to Azure AD has a weird thing that it does that I uncovered, and that I created my own user table because I wanted to have my own information I put in for users. So I wasn't using the normal users table, but I had all of my fields that I wanted. And then I wanted to, because I wanted to update little things inside that for my application, I created a lookup column to the AAD users table. So let's say I pull up the user Darren, and I've got all kinds of stuff in there that I like. But let's say I wanted to get at some of the AD properties. Okay, so I could say, my user, I've got a variable with that record for my user in my PowerApps application. I could say dot AAD user lookup column that goes over there. What happens when you do that is it goes and loads up all of the users in your organization. So if you have 10,000 employees, that's exactly what I had happen. And I was doing a lookup on the current user with their current email address, and I did a query. And because that lookup column was there, it did not fully, because Powerhouse can only deal with a max of 2,000 records, right? It tried to pull up all 10,000 records, load it into memory, and then of course it only gave me well, I had a particular user, so it only gave me one record that was associated with that. But because I had to join it, I had to go and get all 10,000 records loaded into memory, and my app would take like 5 minutes to load up. I'm like, what is going on? And I narrowed it down. It's like, what is going on with this users table? And when I took out that lookup column, boom, all that problem went away. So that was something that I think is a big deal that I sort of stumbled across. And if I hadn't made that mistake, or made that assumption that I could just do that and it would be efficient, I probably would have never known that to pass that warning on to you guys. So be careful if you have a virtual table that you want to link to as a lookup column, because it could have some unexpected results. Okay. Okay. So sort of zeroing in on our application that we're going to build. So what I did, let me pull up um, my accelerator community here. If you guys aren't in the accelerator program, you might be interested to see all the kinds of things that we do here. But I just created a thread of Chat GPT. Let me see how that comes. Okay, that came up fine. A Chat GPT prompt. Okay. Here's a prompt that I use with Chat GPT that will help pull out all the information needed in order to plan and design your application. Okay. I tell Chat GPT, take on the persona of a successful freelancer as an expert software architect and developer who uses Microsoft Power Apps, and I specified Canvas apps, as opposed to model driven or portals, as a rapid application development tool. Now, keep in mind, ChatGPT is about 2 years behind. I actually asked ChatGPT before I did this. I'm like, hey, do you know what Dataverse is? Because Dataverse originally was called CDS, Common Data Services. I'm not so sure on the S part, but it was called CDS, and they renamed it Dataverse. So thankfully, it didn't know what that is. So I know I didn't have to explain. Hey, you probably know about CDS. That's now Dataverse. Um, I'll play the part of a prospective client that will provide information and ask questions regarding an application. It'll be your job to ask all the questions about my project and my needs in order to do the following. And look what I'm having it create. Create a time and cost estimate, both itemized with totals. Create a listing of the screens, listing of any Power Automate flows. Recommend the best data source. Okay. In this case, I told it, hey, I want to use SQL Server. Create a data dictionary. So it's going to create all of the tables, all of the fields, and all that type of stuff. And we can add on to that and modify it. But it's sort of nice just to have a full list. So you're not thinking, okay, what other thing would I want to track here? It gives you a full list, and you can add or drop to that. But it sort of gives you a good starting point. Okay. This is also useful if you're doing freelancing and you've got a client that comes to you and says, hey, I need an app. It's like, okay, and you could give this prompt and just paste over what they say. Hey, I need a CRM system. And just watch what it spits out. It's going to say, okay, well, what do you need to keep track of specifically? And it will just pull out and define all these things. Um, Create the data dictionary, okay, which is a listing of the tables and columns, the field types and the primary keys, foreign keys, relationships, all that type of stuff. And I actually spell that out for it. Create a feature list, okay, with user stories. Create a listing of tasks and a project plan. So here is all the stuff that I recommend that you do. And I actually tell it, hey, don't start generating this stuff right away because I'm just going to give you a general description and like don't start generating this stuff. And I actually say right now, please just ask the questions that you need in order, and it will ask you questions. Okay. Once you have all the answers, simply tell me I'm ready to provide this solution. Then I'll ask these things one by one. Be sure to ask as many questions as you'd like to do this. Please let me know if you become aware of anything in my project that might pose a problem with any limitations regarding the Power Platform. So if I say like, oh, I'm writing an app for all my customers that want to sign up for service, well, that's going to tell you with a Canvas app, that's going to be a huge problem. You could add them as an external user, but that won't be automated. That will be more like a manual process, or you'd have to create some code, maybe a script, a PowerShell script or something um, that would call APIs within Azure AD to add them as a external guest user. Okay, so it's not. That's sort of like one of the big limitations in my crash course. I talk about the 10 things that you must know before start writing apps and Power Apps. And one of the things that I touch on are the limitations. And I came up with 7 limitations. And if you have those limitations, you might want to steer people away from Power Apps. Now, I'd say 90% of the time, I'm like, that isn't an issue. But, if somebody is looking to build a highly performant engineering application dealing with thousands and thousands of rows, maybe it's a utility application that, that's gonna be a little bit. Power Apps probably isn't the best solution for that. What Power Apps' biggest strength is it's a rapid application development or RAD tool. And I love it. And that's the reason why I love it. I can just whip out apps. But there are some cases where like, yeah, you're not going to be able to use Power Apps for that. But you'll be astonished by the things that you can do on the Power Platform to get around different limitations. Most of the time, I've got situations where I can do that, get around those limitations. Okay. So, so this is the prompt that I have. So if you're in the accelerator program, you can respond to this, maybe even recommend some additions to this or some edits. If you guys, you know what I'll do is I will provide the link to my free school community. So if you guys want anything there, let me include that real quick, just so you guys can see that. So I've got a link here at the top. Okay, that's for the yeah. If you want to book a call with us, with me and Kurt, and talk about your needs, we can talk about you joining the accelerator program. So that's what that link is there, tinyurl.com/PowerApps Accelerator. That's not the one I meant to bring up. It is this one, Power Platform Community. That is a tiny URL that will take you to my free community, where I could actually post this there as well. I have no problem doing that. It's not like I'm trying to keep that a secret. Okay, so what I'd like to do is show you what happened between me and ChatGPT this morning as I was preparing. Okay, so um, based on what it said here, um, where are my notes? My notes are right here. I've got my AI prompt here. So let's pull this over and I'll show you what happened. So I wrote this prompt. I had a prompt that I used in the past, and I'm like, I want to create a better one. So this is what I created this morning. Okay. And so you guys just saw this. Okay. And this is what I told it. I need an onboarding and engagement application. Such app will be used for use it for new employees, new customers, clients, students. Okay. This app will onboard users and keep them engaged by having the input and manage information and documents about themselves. Maybe their contact information, their goals and priorities, all that type of stuff. Like if you're onboarding a new employee, a lot of times in onboarding, like, hey, where do you want to be here in this organization in 5 years? Do you want to be a manager? Do you want to be doing something like, let's say you're coming as a developer, maybe you want to manage networks, and that's been really your ultimate dream, but you did, so you might have people share that with you, provide checklists to help them get on board, like watch this video, complete this exercise, fill out this information, sign this agreement. Um, Email reminders on users on the steps they still need to complete. Ask if they're happy, if they've like, all that type of stuff that you would do probably in any of those situations. Um, some data will be input and maintained by staff and not the person being onboarded, such as the start date, enrollment date, any other type of information. Let's say if it's a customer, have they paid in full? Are they on a payment plan? Or, all kinds of stuff like that that would be more internal and not, accessible by the end user that's being onboarded. Um, so for questionnaires, so this is going to be a cool little feature. So a lot of times people ask me about creating, and Jeff, I believe you're in. Well, let me make sure I got my chat up here. Okay. Yeah, Jeff, you asked a question. I know you're here, so hopefully you're listening to this. I know that your application, you've got a lot of sort of questionnaire checklist type of stuff. So you're really going to probably take a big interest as I'm building this app. And I plan on building this app with you guys. Okay. So we're not going to finish the app all today. We're going to get started on the app. So you're going to see me as I build the whole app with SQL Server and how I do all this stuff. Okay. So I get a lot of questions about how to do questionnaire or checklist type of applications. So you're going to see how I do all that, sort of a high in demand or a frequently asked scenario. So, and I say all that, I explain all that. Okay. I also want to specify the data types. So if I ask a question that's a yes, no type of question, then I want like a radio button or check boxes or something that's appropriate to the type of answer I'm expecting, not just single line of text for everything. Okay. And Ellie, good to see you on here. Perfect timing. I lobe this. So excited. I'm sure you meant to say love. Yeah. Yeah. Nice having you here, Ellie. Okay. So um, I want this project to be done in SQL Server. Okay. And look, these are numbered questions that ChatGPT came back with. Could you please elaborate on the different types of users and their roles? What are the permissions? And this is my answer: just the users being onboarded and application administrate app admins. Okay, internal staff. Required documents, and wanted to know, hey, what type of documents do we want to restrict? What specific document? I'm like, hey, keep that dynamic. I want this app to be very flexible for any type of situation. I want to be able to sell this app if I want to. Somebody needs a onboarding app, and I could put a web page out there. Hey, you need an onboarding app? Let me know. I can sell you this app for, I don't know, $10 a month or whatever to cover my licensing cost on Microsoft, of course, and all the SQL Server costs, and then hopefully to have some type of a profit margin in there as well. But yeah, you could sell your apps like this and host the data inside a SQL Server. Okay, that's actually another reason that I recommend to use SQL Server is if you want to sell your PowerApps software as a service and request some type of a monthly fee each month. You don't want to put that in Dataverse and in a Canvas app because you need to install it in their tenant. Okay, and at that point, they could just tell you after a year or maybe after a month after you deploy it, and they're happy with it. They could just say, "Okay, we don't need your software anymore. So we're going to stop paying you." But they could just keep using your software because it's all in their tenant and it's all between them and Microsoft at that point with all the licensing costs and the space. Um, so, and a lot of software companies are going this way, um, in that instead of paying some one big cost for some software, maybe they just spend 10 or $20 a month per user or something like that. So this is a great way of implementing something like this is that you have the SQL Server host all the data for all your customers. Okay, you might need to design your database slightly differently. Like on each table, you need some type of a client ID or tenant ID or something like that. Okay, to keep all the data separate, even though it's all there together within the same tables. Um, and then yeah, so you host the data for them, um, which is sort of neat. And some clients like that. They don't want to have to pay a huge big price tag at the beginning. I like the fact that I can go to Microsoft and say, hey, I want to pay $6 a month. Give me my own tenant, my own SharePoint, all my stuff, and just pay $6 a month. That's sort of neat. I'll continue to pay that in perpetuity. That's no problem. $6 a month. That's a great deal, and not have to pay hundreds of dollars for Office, and then um, you know go buy SharePoint server, and then build a server and install it on that, and then buy Exchange and install that, and then have to manage that server. Software as a service isn't. Some people are like, oh, you want to nickel and dime me every month. No, it's actually a huge benefit. A lot of people do like that, including myself. So just throw that out there. So I give it responses here. Okay, the customization. How flexible do you want in terms of customizing the user interface? I have my application template that does some dynamic theming and stuff, so I got that taken care of. I'll be using my application template. Okay. Um, Communication preferences, and I answer no to that. So I'm just gonna slowly go, scroll through this so you can read this. You can pause and look at some of these responses I gave it. But what's important is after you look at these things, and I tell it on some, I make it, the dynamic flexibility, where it's important to me, because I'll need a lot of tables created for that flexibility. I make sure it's clear on that. Um, I'll be setting up ad. It was wanting to know if I wanted to, pay extra for the Azure setup and all that type of stuff. Well, I can show you guys how to do that. Of course, in this case, I'll be doing all that myself. I do have the licensing, and I think I actually specified that in my prompt. Is like, hey, make sure if you recommend SQL Server Dataverse that you need to ask me and see if I or the client has the premium licensing. Okay. So maintenance support, maybe 3 months of bug fixes and minor changes. Okay. And it tried to get me to give it my timeline or my budget. I'm like, nope, just tell me how long it will take. Budget as cheap as possible without sacrificing quality. um, but I do the same thing while freelancing. I'll try to get some type of an idea. If they need it, or if the deadline's next week, then if they really want it done, I'm going to take over the project. I have to drop maybe some current projects or maybe push them off a little bit, so that I'd have to charge a premium for that. So that would affect the price and stuff. Um, and it made some suggestions here, reports, analytics to measure effectiveness of onboarding and engagement, statistics, onboarding process completion rates, feedback response rates. I'm like, wow, that sounds great. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up this Word document again. And so what I did after it said, it was like, hey, I'm ready to pretty much tell you to give you this stuff. I'm like, okay, give me a general application description. Okay. And this is what it gave me. Um, Something I'm dealing, hopefully you guys can't hear this. I have 2 toddlers downstairs that are just screaming. Of course, my wife is down there with them. So I'm listening to all that. It's a little a little stressful trying to concentrate and everything while listening to all that. So anyway, um, so the general application description here. You know what? Let's make this bigger, so you guys can read this better, okay? So let's zoom in on this, okay? So generally when, someone comes to you like, "Hey, I need an application." Well, okay, well, tell me more. And then you'll get about a paragraph of information. So that's generally um, what you'll get. You'll get like a little paragraph like this, and then you try to get some more details. So I told Chat GPT, "Hey, give me more of a thorough, description, maybe 3 paragraphs long." Okay, and as I've taught you guys, gathering the requirements, you want to define all the entities, all the nouns, okay, that your application needs to manage, okay, and those becomes your database tables. Maybe even you're going to be creating screens based on those entities, right? Okay, so I'm just going to show you what it created here. I'm like, hey, give me a full feature list. Boom, it gave me a bulleted list of all the features. Isn't that nice? Okay, so this is what I recommend. This is the most efficient way of starting off a project, doing your planning and design. It saves you so much time. Um, when I was a kid, a child in the 80s, I was born in the 70s, but I should say mid 70s. I was going through school in the 80s, and I learned how to do math. I learned how to spell words and read and write and everything. But with the ubiquitousness of, or the techno of ubiquitousness of technology, the technology being everywhere and freely available, like calculators. Um, yeah, I can do complex multiplication and division. Um, I don't know. Doing the long form of division, that might I might have to sit there and smoke might come out of my ears. How did I do this back in the 3rd grade? you know? But with calculators, on everybody's cell phone, you sort of get rusty with that, right? Um, and gathering requirements can be a very lengthy process that can take days, spread out over many meetings, but perhaps weeks, meetings upon meetings, getting more and more information, and then getting the stakeholders to sort of go back and forth. Like you'll be in a meeting with them and they're like, oh, yeah, we need a screen that does this. And the other person in the room will say, yeah, it needs to do this. And then they'll just argue back and forth, like, no, it doesn't need to do that because we've got this other system that does this. And they'll go on for like, 10 minutes about one little thing. And you're trying to take notes and you're just sitting there. It's like, hey, would you guys mind meeting about that or having multiple meetings about that and just let me know what you as a group decide on. So it's actually easiest to deal with one main person that will talk with the whole group of people and come back to you with a single answer because you'll be taking notes and you'll write something down. Okay, I need a feature that does this. And then they'll start debating back and forth. And then you're like, mark it out, or you'll erase it and write something else down. And then they'll change their mind again. Uh, I, I see Nick over in private chat. That's my former life. Yeah, guys, it happens. It's sort of like saying requirements never change. No, the requirements going to change. Um, and when they see visuals, they're going to change their mind. There's no exception, guys. There's just no exception. Even if you're creating an application for yourself, for your own personal reasons, in the middle of it, you're like, oh, actually, I want it to do this instead. you know, so absolutely. Um, so I think of ChatGPT and what I've done here this morning, sort of like using a calculator to do a bunch of calculations. Okay. And I talked about reading and writing and spelling. Well, while using email software like Outlook or using spell check within Word, and you know, I feel like I'm a horrible speller now because it always changes it for me. A lot of times I'll Google a word and Google will let me know, did you mean this? You know, I'm like, oh yeah, I misspelled that word. That's usually if I'm not in something like Word, I'll Google it. Um, so I've become really dependent upon technology. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that's not something I want to tackle here, but I can tell you this is saving me a lot of time for $20 a month for ChatGPT, and in some cases free. It's an amazing tool, and I recommend utilizing it. Okay. Um, However, there's one caveat here. You almost need on your first project, maybe not use Chat GPT. Just in the way back in third grade, I learned my multiplication tables without using a calculator. Okay, because there might be a case where you're on a client site and you don't have your laptop with you. I mean, you do have your mobile device, right? I guess you could do that, but you're not going to sit there and um, I always like to get things in writing from clients and customers because I can paste things that they've said into ChatGPT and say, ChatGPT, go through all this and spit out, things that you see here. When you're in a meeting or it's a Zoom call, um, you're gonna have to either record it and take notes later and type that up and then feed that in. You might need to do this type of stuff without the use of ChatGPT. Okay. So it's sort of good to know how to do this without it. But after you feel like you've got a good handle on it, I would say utilize this all day long. If you're learning how to spell, don't use a word processor. Learn how to spell. But I think you guys understand where I'm going with this, with the technology. It's a great technology. So there's the feature list. Here's my data dictionary. Here's all my tables. Here's all my fields for the database, the data types. I told it to, I'm using SQL Server, so it's giving me SQL Server types. Okay, instead of like single line of text for, SharePoint. Okay. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't have it just create an ERD diagram for me. That would have been nice. Um, but ChatGPT gives you text answers. It can format things in tables, like you're going to see here. I say, hey, create all the user stories for me. This is an example of a user story. As a new user, I want to register in the app and manage my profile so that I can begin the onboarding process and manage my information. Okay. Yeah. Um, yeah, just keeping an eye on all the comments here. Um, so yeah, here's all of my I see Michelle's taking off. Yeah, take care, Michelle. Good having you on. Um, So this is really good stuff here, guys. This instead of having to sit here and think about think everything through, and it does a lot of thinking for me. Okay, you need to review what it gives you. A lot of times that I've seen here is that they will, or I say they, ChatGPT will talk about, oh, you need a login screen, and sometimes I'll actually tell it, ChatGPT, we're using M365. Why do I need a login screen? It takes care and ChatGPT will like, "Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry about that." So sometimes it will talk about that, and so that's something that I've noticed that sometimes you need to omit unless you're creating some type of a kiosk type of application where maybe they've logged into, like, a service account or something, and then everybody uses that same account. Um, and in that case, you probably do need a login screen. So I created one for a work order system. If you go over to my playlists, it's called a work order system for a garage, where I actually did a system like that. If you're interested in seeing an example of that, you can see that there. Okay, here's all my screens. Okay, all kinds of good stuff. Okay, and that's where I left it. And you could get, what about your wireframes? It's not going to create my wireframe sketches for me, but so that's the amount of planning and design that I wanted to do for this example. Okay, so what am I going to do here? I am going to pull up Azure. Okay, and make sure I've got the right screen here. Okay, so this is Azure. Okay, so this is my account here, and I'm going to go over to SQL databases, and I've got two databases here. I'm going to create a new one. Okay, and I'll zoom in here so everybody can see everything really nice. Okay, okay, so I've got a subscription. I already have a resource group set up, and that resource group has been set up. Um, Here in the Eastern United States. Okay, so you create a resource group based on where it needs to be geologically. Is that the right word, Jeff? Geographically.
Geographically, that's right.
Geographically. Thank you. A database name. What should we call this? I'm going to call it onboarding. Um, okay, so that's available. I don't know if I want to become more specific than that. I think that's generally what I want to call it. I don't want to get too complicated with the name there. I've already set up a server here in the East US. I don't want to use an elastic pool. You can find out more about the elastic pool by hovering over this and reading all this, or hitting pause and reading this if you want. That's not what I want the video to be about. However, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see the cost. All right. So for the cost of a used car payment of under $400 a month, you can have yourself a SQL Server database. How about that? Well, that is for a production database. Okay. So going back to why you wouldn't want to use SQL Server, well, that costs a little bit more than Dataverse, doesn't it? Okay. So you're going to pay for it. Now, if you just want to have a developer database, well, that's a little different. That's a little more affordable here. I'm going to scroll down, and you'll see here it wants to know the workload environment. Well, if you're just developing, okay, Jeff says up in Canada, that's only a thousand Canadian. That's cheap. All right. All right. For some people, that might be cheap, and some people that might be a little expensive. If you're a developer just trying to learn, that might be a bit on the expensive side. So in that case, you hit development. Okay. So let's see up here how much a developer database would cost, and I can actually get it cheaper than $5 a month. Okay, that's USD. So I mean, we all have things that we pay for every month. Like I pay for YouTube every month. I don't really care for ads. I've got a Netflix account and this account. So what's another $5? Well, if you're a developer and you've got 15 dev databases out there, well, that's $50 a month. Well, that sort of adds up over time, right? So I'm going to go down here and look at any other options. And if I were to click Elastic Pool, um, then I think it takes development option off the table here. So that's why you don't want Elastic. um, well, look at this compute and storage. I'm going to zoom in here so you guys can see this a little better. Right here. All right. So even though we're a development database here, we're going to get one vCore, 32 gigabytes of storage. Do we need 32 gigabytes to start off with? I would say no, especially for a dev environment. Even if you start storing images, you might get up to a gig or two. For a production database, and you're storing files in there, yeah, you might need some space to hold all those documents and everything. You know what I mean? But we can go in here and configure this and say, hey, this is I'm just trying to learn, guys. Do you have to charge me so much? And you want to stick with the serverless. If we want to do the um, the cheapest option, possible here. Okay. And we'll go down here. We can mess with the cores. That's not what I want to do. What you want to do is go down here. What I like is this enable auto pause. So if I'm developing an app and I don't use it for a month and I go back in there and start, I want that thing to pause, not be using up resources. Okay. Also, I don't need 32 gigabytes. Go down to 2 gigs or 4 or 5 gigs. Okay. Now I'm going to scroll back up. We're down to 30 cents a month. Now, guys, that's a little bit more doable. Okay. So if you're doing development, you got 50 databases out there. That's not so bad. Well, maybe to begin with, 1 gigabyte's fine. Okay. Um, so that's not a bad option. I think I'm going to stick with I'm gonna go with 2 for now. And I might change probably will change these options later because I plan on using this in a more resource intensive way. And if I want to use this as production, I'll probably create a separate one. Um, and in a lot of cases in development projects, what you will have, the larger the organization, the more you'll see this. Okay. Uh, if you're doing development, you've got a development environment, a Power Apps environment for dev, and that will point to a developer database. And then when you deploy it out to test for users to test it, you'll have a Power Apps environment called test. It could be called anything, but it'll probably have the word test in there. Um, that will point to a test database. And sometimes they'll create another environment called UAT, which is for user acceptance testing. Um, that will point to a UAT database. And then you might have staging and the one last step before it goes to production. Okay. Or maybe you won't have staging. You'll just have production at that point. So you have different levels and different resources allocated to these different databases and environments. Okay. So I thought I'd mention that since it's very pertinent. Okay. So I'm just going to create this and zone redundant. I don't care about zone redundancy for now. I'm just going to hit apply. Okay. And now I've got some more options to look at. Now that I've picked that, I'm up to 30 cents a month. I'm going to click on next for networking. Okay. So this is actually important as you're creating this database. Allow Azure services and resources to access the server. You want to say yes. For some reason, it's not allowing me to do that. And perhaps that's set on the server side because what you guys haven't seen is I actually you have to set up a SQL server first, and then you can set up all these SQL databases under that. Okay. So I might need to go in there and change that at the server level. In fact, I might go try to change that right now because I want this set up right. And I'm a little surprised that I didn't already have that set up to be accessed. And the reason why that's important, guys, is we want Azure services to be able to access it. Okay, so let's say we got PowerApps. Well, that needs to access it, right? Or you have something else in Azure that you might want to access. So if I have something housed in Azure or some type of cloud services with Microsoft, yeah, why not? Why not allow it to be able to access that? So here are all the settings, maybe that I don't want the world to see about my server. But it really doesn't matter because there are firewalls and you wouldn't be able to access it anyway. Um, you see add current client IP address. Okay. And I'll say yes. Okay. So I can open up SQL Server Management Studio and connect to it. It will allow my IP address to access it, but it won't allow any other IP addresses out in the world to access it. So there's a little bit of security. So as far as hackers are concerned, SQL servers are really good targets because accessing databases, it's got all kinds of useful information in there, like people's social security numbers, if they're not encrypted, or credit card numbers, all kinds of interesting stuff, people's email addresses. Um, so you should pay attention to security. And as long as you don't open it up to the world, you really shouldn't have to worry about that. I'm fairly certain, there's a firewall blocking out all these IP addresses, and I manually add an IP address that needs to access it. I feel fairly safe, um, and I've done a fair amount of server administration, installing servers and maintenance, that type of stuff. One of the things I did back, or probably about 15 years ago, I was I had my own dedicated server in a hosting environment. So I had full access to the server, and I got myself I got a real standard license to SQL Server. I installed it on the server to be used, and then I opened it up so anybody could connect to it, because I had a Windows application that I wanted to connect to that SQL Server, and that server was busy dealing with all of these IP addresses, trying to connect to it and trying username and passwords and trying to get in there all the time. And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, like all these resources are being devoted to all these, I guess, hackers and people trying to scan ports on this IP address." And it was a little bit of a nightmare. I always had to like do things security wise. So I'm glad that all this is sort of set up this way. Um, so anyway, let me see if I can find this real quick. If I can, I'm sort of curious on this Azure services if PowerApps is included in that. So right now, I'll just leave it as no. Um, let's see here. You can add private endpoints if you want. Let's say if you had an application or a service that needed to access this, not through PowerApps, you could add those there. And you've got connection policies. I'll go on to security. Now they have a Microsoft Defender for SQL. So they've got some services that you could buy if you want, and you can find out more about it by hovering over this. Okay. So I'm looking at the private chat here. Nick says you, if if I guess if you use a mobile Power App, how you manage their IP address. Well, with Power Apps, their IP address isn't really what's used. So you're on a mobile device. Yeah, you use a mobile Power App. So on a mobile device, you download Power Apps on your device, and then you log in to your tenant. And you're going to see the app, all the apps that have been shared with you or that you've created, and you'll click on it. Well, what you're doing is your traffic is going through uh, the Power App servers, not directly from your device. So in that case, you don't have to worry about IP addresses. We just need to make sure that the Power App servers can get in there. Okay. And we're going to find that out here in a little bit. Um, and if we can't, we got to somehow go in there and allow that. Okay. Um, so I'm not going to go into all this. For my dev database, I'm just going to keep going here. Any type of additional settings. Start with a blank database, restore from a backup. No, I mean, if you already have a SQL Server database that you wanted to use to start off with, you could do that. You could use a sample database. Um, I'm trying to think. That actually might not be a bad idea to grab user data. But I think I'd like to start with a fresh new database. That's fine. If you use a sample, it's going to use the AdventureWorks sample database that's been out there since like 2005. So it's been out there for a while. So some of you might be familiar with that. If you do a search for sample database AdventureWorks, you can find out more information about that. And I am going to click next. I don't really care about tags for this. I'm just going to keep going. And I am ready to create this. Okay, I'm going to click on the create button and it's going to go create it. Right. And as you see there, it's going to take a few moments and it should alert us once it's created. And got to mess with all the username and password type of information connecting to it.
Right.
So I am going to hit refresh. Sometimes you hit refresh. Maybe it's no, it's still working there. This is a great time for questions, guys. While we're waiting on this.
I don't have any yet. I'm interested to see what it spits out though.
Yeah.
So when well, I guess I do have one question. You've done this before, obviously. What kind of tinkering do you have to do with it? Do you have to, as far as like coding, is there stuff that's maybe just a step off that you have to tweak? What do you have to do? Is there any of that?
Well, there is a little bit of coding if you want to create your own views. So you're going to see me doing that. And we did a little bit of that this last week, I think, in our accelerator group calls. You can see, I mean, we'll eventually do it here, but yeah. So my main thing after you create the database, your next step is to connect to it. Connect to it with SQL Server Management Studio. Now that is a free download, so I recommend just doing a Google for SQL Server Management Studio. And you can type SSMS and it'll come right up. Say SSMS download, and you'll find it. And you can download that from Microsoft. It's a free tool, and then you can connect to SQL Server databases as well as Dataverse databases. And but for the SQL Server, native SQL Server databases, we'll create all of our tables through that and do everything, design wise, create all the tables. And then the next step after that is to connect from PowerApps. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So it is done. Deployment is complete, and it's got a little button here. Go to resource. Okay, so here's the information, and you guys can see all the server name. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to hide my screen just for a moment. And I'm going to bring up my SQL Server Management Studio and make sure that I don't have any. I thought I already had the window open, but I didn't. I want to actually pull up information without typing any passwords or anything live, public to the world. All right, here's SQL Server there. Okay. Okay. Now it connected to my previous tenant. So I actually have two different Azure accounts. So one thing that I stepped you guys through last Saturday morning in the accelerator program was I showed you how to set up Azure. So I have a completely separate Azure because I did that. And so that's what has been set up. So I'm going to create a new server registration. I'll actually show you what I'm doing. And then if I need to type in a password or something, I'll just hide it. Okay. So this is what SQL Server Management Studio looks like. Okay. And so I created a database called I Need an App, not I Need a Nap. So if you register a server, you type in the logon and password, you connect to it. You can double click on it and it brings the server up down here. So you can see the database that we created this last week. We actually used the sample database, so we'd have a little bit of data to work with. Okay. And while that's opening up, that takes, see, the thing is that my first DB actually set up to auto pause. So it's going to take a moment to wake up. Isn't that funny? Okay, so what I'm going to do, actually, I'll show this and use this on the other screen. And what I need to do is my SQL Server and find the logon and password while we're waiting for that thing to load up. And there's that. Okay. It's saying that it's not available, but it is available. That's sort of funny. Okay. So I'm seeing the information up here on my other screen. Her name. And let's go find out. What is my password? So I'm going to tell you one of my jokes, and after I tell my joke, Jeff, I want you to tell us a joke, and then Nick, you're up in line to tell us a joke. What do you call a fish with no eyes? Psh. Psh.
That's a dad joke.
It is. I keep
But
all
I'm
my
not-
dad jokes
Yeah.
in a dad a base.
Eek. Yeah, but I'm not sure I can do much better.
What you got? You got any jokes for us?
None that are live worthy.
Okay. Nick, you have any good jokes, dad jokes or otherwise that would be appropriate or G-rated?
Your mic's not on, Nick. You might have some jokes coming in the comments there.
Yeah. Do you know who I saw today? I don't know who you saw today. Well, we're waiting, Jeff. Everyone I looked at. I don't know if I get it.
What happens to an illegally parked frog?
What happens to a what?
Illegally parked frog.
An illegally parked frog. I have no idea.
It gets towed away.
What
What did the DNA say to the other DNA?
I'm not sure.
Do these genes make me look fat?
All right. I
This is a
think I've got
contentious one. Well, last one is content. What's the difference between an outlaw and an in-law?
I don't know.
Outlaws are wanted.
Oh, that's funny.
That's a good one.
I'm gonna put my server name in there. I'm gonna use SQL Server authentication, and I'm not gonna show my login and password. For the password, and then you notice. Let me see if I can just show some of this. At the bottom of that little dialog, there's a little test button, which I like to use. Test. Hopefully it comes back as successful. You always cross your fingers because sometimes you can beat your head against the wall about why can't it connect? It's usually a firewall. All right, so I'm going to save that. I'm going to minimize that one, and I'm going to double click on that server that I have. Oh my goodness, Rick. I'm afraid for the calendar. Its days are numbered. I'm gonna have to start a whole new YouTube channel, guys, called Dad Jokes.
Dad jokes.
All right, guys, here is our database we created in Azure. It's right here. So especially if you guys are brand new to SQL Server, SQL Server Management Studio, just now that you're seeing this, let the floodgates open for any questions of curiosity. Okay. Here's the database. This is the server. Here are all the database tables. I'm going to double click on tables and it's going to open that up. I don't have any tables yet. Isn't that great? I like starting from a blank slate here. Okay. But I already know all the tables I'm going to create. Okay. So let me open up my Word document with all my requirements. And let's go to our data dictionary. Okay. So the very first thing would be users. Yes. Um, yeah. Let's do users. Okay. So I'm going to right click on tables and I'm going to say new table. So you notice it didn't create a bunch of columns for us. It doesn't have any columns in this database table at all. Okay. So I always like to have that ID. I like how SharePoint does its IDs. I'm going to make it an integer. Okay. I'm also going to make it the primary key. Now, primary keys aren't really something you have to worry about with SharePoint or Dataverse. Okay. Because it creates them for you. But we're here in SQL Server, and so we're in here with the big boys. So we gotta have to take big boy responsibility and think of certain things that we normally wouldn't have to think about. Okay, like the primary key. Now, my screen here, it's difficult. I can't like zoom in on the interface here, but what you'll notice there's a little key up here on the toolbar within this window. It's a little highlighted in yellow. Do you guys see that? I hover over it. It says set primary key. Okay, so every single database table that I create, especially in SQL Server, where I have the control over it, is always create an ID. And every table has an ID, and that's always the primary key. It's always unique. And if I have any worries that I need to import data from different places and they might have different IDs, I might create a GUID, a unique identifier like Dataverse does, but that really doesn't fall into the requirements very often for me. So in that case, I always create an integer, an auto incrementing in Microsoft Access. It's called an auto number. In SharePoint, it's not really talked about very much. It's just the ID, and it's an auto incrementing number. In SQL Server, it's called an identity. Okay, an identity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that set primary key, and now it's a primary key. And there's a little pane right here that I pull up. Okay. And these are things that I can set for this column. Okay. So I'm going to make sure that's selected and look at this. So if I go down here, I'll see something about identity. It's called identity specification and it expands. Okay. And what I do is it says identity. I just double click on that and it changes it to yes. So the very first record will be 1 and any new records will be incremented by 1. Now I could start off, you know how you start a new checking account with your local bank? Like, hey, do you want your check numbers to start off with 1? You're like, no, start them off with 10,000. So it doesn't look like you just started the account, right? So you could do the same thing with your identity. Um, somebody like, oh, I'm a new user in the system. I haven't got the ID of 1. You could start off with 1,000,000 or something, or a few thousand. If you want to. I always start off with this one thing here. So that has been set. The primary key has been set. That's good. Now, I want to keep track of first name. Now you don't want to put space. You could put spaces in here, but you always have to have things around it if it has a space in there. So good database naming practice is not to include spaces. So you guys probably thought I was weird whenever I create all my SharePoint databases. I never put spaces in there. That's because that's good database design. You just don't put spaces in there. In fact, you use proper casing most of the time. Some old school database DBAs, database administrators, or if you come from a mainframe world, a lot of times they'll have these on the field names in all uppercase, and they'll separate the words with underscores and an underline. So sometimes you'll see that. Okay. And sometimes the best practices or the standard that you have to adhere to is dictated by the organization you're working with or for. Okay. Now, first name, I want that to be varchar. maybe 25 characters for first name, last name. Okay, we're gonna have here a varchar. Last names can get a little bit longer. Sometimes they're hyphenated. I might make that 100 characters just to account for all kinds of different stuff. Okay. Um, I'm also gonna add something here, a display name. Okay, I'm gonna make that varchar 255, and a display name. A lot of times I like to use for maybe I want the first and last name put together. Maybe I also want to say Mr., Mrs., and or maybe have a nickname and parentheses. It's just something that I can do. Um, that's already got the first and last name or whatever the user wants to be displayed in a system. You know, so sometimes it's nice to have a display name there like that. Okay. What else has ChatGPT suggested that I do? So I've got an email one, email two, and what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to call it email one and two. I'm going to say, um, I'll say,
Primary email.
well, what I want to capture is the email that they're using to log in with. So it's going to be I would say O365 email, but
Mhm.
they don't call it Office 365. They call it M365. And I'm worried if I put M365, they're going to change it to something else in a year. But let's say maybe I'll do that 365 email. Okay, so that will essentially be the primary email for logging into the system, and
Right.
the user function within PowerApps. If you want to grab somebody's email address dynamically, you could utilize that user function dot email address, and it's going to give you that M365 email. Okay, so that's what we're going to put in there. Varchar 255 email addresses aren't usually that long, but just in case they are, I guess they could be. And then I'm going to say personal email. So somebody comes in, they typically have a Gmail, Hotmail, some type of alternate email. So I'll say personal email or alternate. I like alternate. Varchar. That would be good. Other type of stuff would we want to have in here? Communication preference. Okay. And we could make this like has several values, but I almost like what it's suggesting here, which is a free form text entry. Okay. So communication preference. Is that what it called it? That field is a little long there. Yeah. Communication preference. Okay. And perhaps a varchar. Here I'm going to say 500, and I might make it a text area. Um, if people want to type a bunch of stuff in there, I'd like to capture it. I don't want something like, nope, you can't type all that stuff. If they typed in a paragraph, I want to probably get at that paragraph and actually read it. Um, okay, there's a great question here, which is what's the data type in SQL equivalent for multi-line? Um, it's not differentiated between single line or multi-line. It's just how many characters you want to have in there. Okay. So I would say up to 255 characters. You would consider that a single line. Anything over 255 characters, I would consider that a multi-line. Okay. Now, how far up can you go here? It used to be the maximum amount of bytes that are stored in the SQL Server database were 8,000. I don't believe that's a limitation anymore. Um, So it used to be 8,000. Okay. And even then, you could go above and beyond that by using a completely different data type. Okay. So let me do another field here, and we'll call this comments, notes, that type of thing. Maybe notes. But I'm going to have two different type of notes. I'm going to call this user notes. They can type in all the notes that they want. They can type paragraphs upon they could type a gigabyte worth of a Word document in there. And this text field is in an unlimited, it stores it in a different way, like blob storage. it's unlimited. Okay. Perhaps you don't want them to type in that many. So in that case, I'd probably say varchar 1,000 characters is probably enough. 4,000 is probably enough. um, but you could use text there. Um, Something else you can do here is say max, the maximum amount of characters that you give me. So max was, yeah, it puts max in all uppercase like that. So in the case, I don't know what the maximum amount of bytes is for a whole record these days. It used to be 8,000. I've never created so many columns and so much space there that I ran up against that limitation. Um, but if you could, let's say it's 1,000 bytes of information per record, okay? Um, then let's say I've already got 30 columns of space there. By you saying max, it's going to say, give me the maximum amount based on what's left there. That's how I understand that. And that's how I would use that. Okay. Um, so we could do that. I think I'm going to stick with 4,000. Now, the beauty here is you see where it says varchar, varchar, varchar. Okay. Well, I could go in here and say middle initial. Did I spell initial right, Jeff? Initial. I think I did. And in that case, okay, you also see this N. N is for international. So the English language, we got 26 letters in our alphabet, right? And we've got numbers and other things. Well, in terms for a computer to store the information, it stores a number for each of those letters. Then there's uppercase letters and lowercase letters. Everything can be fit within 255 bits of information, zeros and ones. Okay. That gives us 255 different possibilities, and that works for the English language. But you think about Chinese Mandarin or other languages, you're going to need a lot more than 255. Okay. And in that case, if you're making an international application, let's say for other languages, then you'll want to use that N because it uses 2 bytes per character instead of 1 byte. Okay. So if you ever see, because up here for like first name, it doesn't have to be varchar, it could be in varchar if I wanted. And if you go down to the data types, I can show you all the data types. Okay. Look at all this. I don't want to cover anything up here. Let me put, let's make this bigger here if I can. Okay. Jeebus, how many do we have? Okay. I'm going to have to move us to the side or something to see all these. So I want you to see them all. Okay. There we go. Okay. So we do have, if you want specific amount of characters, you want to use char. So if I want a middle initial, I only want one character in there, I would say char, short for character. Okay. Now you see down here, I've got in char. Okay. We also have money. We got text and we have in text. So they're all for a lot of these, there, especially when there's characters involved, you do have this international, the in. Um, okay. So you have the var. What does the var mean? It means variable amount of characters. Okay. So going back here, so the general rule back when I was studying for my Microsoft Certified Database Administration certification that I got years ago, so I'm an MCDBA, is that what they said was if you have 30 or less characters, you should just say char 30. Anything more than 30 characters, if it's going to be a variable amount of characters, use the varchar. And what the varchar does, let's say for first name, I've got varchar 25. Okay, so I'm sort of violating that rule. If I like my name was Da, instead of Darren, DA. Um, is it going to store 25 characters there? No, because it's variable. It's a variable length. It will only store those 2 characters. And then there'll be another character say that, hey, this is the end of the string. Rather than if you had char 25, it would literally take up 25. And if I said DA, it would have a bunch of spaces in there, or it would have a space for a character. It would actually have a place in there and actually store off that little bit of space in the row. So that's sort of important to know about as you're reading and talking about data types for SQL Server. Okay, this is interesting. Data is King says another disadvantage of using Dataverse is if you create the columns in the table, you can't go back and change the data type after the table has been saved. All right. And I'm going to bring this back up from Elias. What data type in SQL is equivalent to multi-line? Okay, so I answer that question, which is text. Okay. So if I was going to do a middle initial, I could just say char1. Okay. And, maybe I'll put it up there. You see, I could drag that up there. That's sort of nice. Okay. Any questions about data types? Ask them now, and I'll cover those quickly. But I want to keep this thing moving. So hopefully we get back over to PowerApps and show you how to connect and everything. Okay. So we've got user notes, and then I'll also say internal notes. Okay. Let's say this is onboarding for my students, and Jeff is one of my students, and I wanted to keep some notes that he's a troublemaker. I might put that in there, and then he wouldn't be able to see it, right? So that'd be an example of internal notes. So like in my ticketing system, people put a description of their ticket, but all the technicians over in IT, they might say, they might have some notes there that maybe aren't nefarious by any means, but it's just like the user doesn't need to know all this stuff that's going on that we're keeping track of about them or their ticket, So these are just some ideas of additional things I would throw into a user table like this. Okay. Is there any issues if we use spaces inside column names? Yes. So I can tell you right away, inside of PowerApps, you're gonna have to put those little single quotes there in order to. It's not that big of a deal, okay? But if you are writing T-SQL, you always have to have these square brackets, and this development environment for SQL Server will try to put these square brackets all over the place. I think it looks so ugly, and if you don't have spaces or weird characters, you don't need them, okay? Um, Now for Dataverse, it's a recommended best practice because it's used by model driven, and the names that you give it are actually display names. They're not actually the column names. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that in Dataverse. You actually look at a column and it has something like a CR 100 underscore, then whatever you gave it without any spaces. That's the real field name in the SQL Server underlying that Dataverse database table. Okay. Um, so anyway, it's typically just not a good practice for a real relational database management system to put spaces in there. Um, in my opinion, it sort of gives away to people if you have a DBA looking over your schema, over your database, like why'd you put spaces in here? You might get asked that. So it in my mind I don't know, it just sort of looks bad. So I wouldn't put any spaces in there unless there's like a really good reason for it. Um, so anyways, we got user notes, internal notes, and let's go back over to my Word document. What else do we have here? Okay. Something that I know that I will want in here is I probably want to capture a user's image. Okay. And I'm going to put that. Now you could say binary. You could do that. You could also store it as, especially since we're using Azure, you could use it, put in an Azure blob storage, which I didn't want to cover. I think for now, I'm just going to use text. Now, especially with SharePoint. A lot of times I store the images as base 64 text and put that in a SharePoint. Because of how SharePoint works now with Dataverse, you do have an image type. And SharePoint does change over time, just making sure there's not an image in here. And there is. Okay, there you go, image. So we'll do that. And what else should we have in here? I think that's probably good for now. Now, you might want to know when it was created, right? Created on date time. Now, there are two different types, date and date time. So you got that flexibility there. Uh, Created by, okay. So varchar, we could probably just put their email address or the email address, the first part of the email address for the username. We could do that. I think I'm going to just take in their M365 email because if I make this application really flexible so that it could handle multiple tenants and different purposes and different clients, an email address would be really good for that. And then I want last modified on date time. You might want to decide early on if you get into SQL Server development for every database table that you create, you're always going to have an ID, like I decide. ID, it's going to be an identity, it's going to be an integer, it's always going to be the primary key for every table. And then you also create these created on, created by, last modified on, last modified by. That is a good idea. R5. Okay, there we go. Okay, now I'm just going to go ahead and save this at this point. And something you'll notice is naming the table is like the last step. Not funny? Right, so we got users, and I'm just going to keep the table name nice, simple, users. Okay, so that's in there. Now, something I'll show you, since probably a lot of you are new to SQL Server, you can create a diagram. There is no need to use View SQL. Is that that's what it's called, right? I always forget the name of what it's called. Is that right, Nick and Jeff?
Draw
Draw,
SQL.
yeah, Draw SQL. Yeah, thank you. So I usually use that, and for SQL Server, it has a diagramming system that is even much better than that. Okay. The first time you try to create a diagram, it's going to say, hey, the database does not have one or more of the supported objects required to use diagramming. Do you want to create them? And you just say yes. So it's going to store the diagram into some system tables probably down here. And it just probably needed to, yep, there you go. They created a table to keep track of these diagrams. Isn't that interesting? So I'll go to diagrams. I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to say new database diagram. Okay. There's my users. So I can add it. Is my microphone picking up my toddler screaming?
No,
Hopefully
no.
not. Okay, good. My fancy microphone is doing some noise canceling here. Okay, so there's
Right.
my table. Now, if you had one of many relationships, you can create those relationships and see the lines and everything. In fact, you guys remember what we did inside the accelerator sessions that we did together? We already have a diagram. Looks like we've got two diagrams for some reason. Oh yeah, this is great. We pulled over all these tables
Yeah.
and it's got all these relationships. Isn't that cool? And I think we can zoom out and zoom in and all types of really cool stuff here. Okay. So it's a great diagramming tool. I love it. And also what's nice is if I were to go down here and say, well, I could actually go in here and there's some things up for the table designer. Look at this. I could look at some more things. I thought I'd see some. You can set this up so you can actually, yeah, table view, standard, keys, name only, custom. So if I said standard, look at that. I've got all the data types there. So I could just sit here, add more columns, do all the data. I can do it all right here from the diagram and see all the other related tables. SQL Server is great. Love it. Now I'm going to save the diagram. Diagram 0. That's not a good name for it. I'm going to say this main diagram. Okay. And I can close this for now. I'm going to close that one for now. Okay, so we have a table here. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to create, open up, okay, so I've got this open, PowerApps, let that open here for a moment. Go into the right environment here. Okay. So I'm going to create a, I need my, let's use, you know what I need is the most recent version of my template. So I'm going to upload that real quick. And my way of uploading my template is I just create a throwaway project here so that I can upload it very easily. Okay, so what I'm going to do here within the Accelerator school environment, I'm going to go over to Classroom with all my downloads. As Accelerator student, you have access to all my stuff here. So I'm going to go into the Jumpstart kit. And I want the landscape template. I'm going to download that really quick. All right. And I am going to save that to downloads. That sounds like a good spot to save it. Okay, there it is. I can get rid of that. All right. So now that I got this little test app that I'm going to throw away here, I can hit just Control O. Okay, I'm going to click Browse. And I can go to Start Kit. Do I want to save that little throwaway project? No, I do not. And so then it's going to upload it into its place there. Now, what's the first thing that we should do when we start a new project? Nick or Jeff, can you tell me?
You've got to save it.
Save it.
Save it.
Yes. Save early, save often.
Save
I
early,
still make
save
that
often.
mistake. I still make that mistake sometimes. Hit save. Oh my goodness, it drives me nuts. Hopefully, I was sort of hoping it was going to prompt me for a different name. This is fine. I'll hit save as, and I'm going to call this onboarding. Save. Okay. Now within PowerApps, click off of that. Settings. You'll know that it does. I'll change this to 2000. I'm a risky type of guy. I live on the edge. It will save every 2 minutes, but unless you do that initial save, it won't start doing that. So that's really important to do. I don't need my video there, so I'll take that out. Okay. Now, the first thing that I want to do is actually connect to my SQL Server database. So I'm going to hit Add Data. I'm going to go down here into Connectors, SQL Server. Okay, now here we go. I don't have to do this very often, so sometimes, well, it's going to be SQL Server authentication. That's the login and the password that I have for it, so that's what I'm going to pick. And if you wanted to connect to an on-premise SQL Server, you could pick this on-premise data gateway. If that's the case, that's a whole other ball of wax. Question is, how often should I publish? my PowerApps applications? Well, whenever you want the users to see your new changes. If you're in the middle of fixing a bug or in the middle of developing a new screen, you don't want to publish until you're done, right? So it's sort of like if you were creating a web page on your website and you started maybe a new blog entry and you were creating a draft and you weren't quite done. Well, when you were done with it and you're ready for people to start seeing it, that's when you would want to publish, right? So the same thing holds true for your applications. Okay, so I'm going to use cloud services. See that it calls it cloud services there. Okay, so I'm going to use. I think what I'm going to do is hide my screen for a moment because I don't want to show all my credential information here. And so you'll put in the server name, database name, username, and password. Okay, that's what it's expecting there. So my database name is onboarding. Okay. That there, my username is that. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is click on that little connect button at the bottom. And it warns me, hey, this is a premium feature. And I'm like, I'm fine with that. Okay. And now I'm going to show my screen now. And look what it shows me after I hit that connect button. Here are 3 tables, one of which we knew about. And these other 2 are, if you ever see something that starts with sys, those are system tables that were created by SQL Server. So there's the table for the diagrams, and here's one for firewall rules. Okay, so I'm going to click on just users for now. I'm going to add that. Okay. And so we're going to be doing lots of really cool stuff on this project. This will be an ongoing project. Hopefully you guys are excited about watching me build a SQL Server type of application together. And we'll go into all the views and everything. But for right now, I just want to see that this works. Okay. So I'm going to do something here that I actually, um, you know what? I already have a gallery. I was about to pull over a data table. I always recommend people don't do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say this new screen. Look at this new screen here. And I'm going to duplicate this new screen because I might want to duplicate it in the future. And I'm going to call this my user management screen. Okay. And inside of this, make this a little bigger here for us. I'm going to go look at users. Here we go. And what do we want to display here? Well, let's just look at first name without the apostrophe. This one will be last name. And then here in this text box, I don't want to do anything just yet. Let's do a patch. I did not spell that right. Okay. We want to patch the users table. Is it user or users? Oh man.
Users.
I don't know why it said user. Is it talking about, if I said user, what is it? Yeah, it's talking about the user function. Okay. Users. Okay. And then the second parameter will be defaults, which tells us we want to add a new record. Okay. And of course, the screen can patch existing records, but right now we just need to get some data in there. The third parameter for patch, we have some curly braces and specify the values. Okay. So we're going to have first name. What's first name? Well, I'm going to use this little text box here, and I'm going to call this text box txt first name. Here, name. one we're going to say last name, txt last name. And for the default value, it'll be last name. And then for notes, we'll call this maybe internal notes. Okay, there we go. And we'll rename the text box txt internal notes. First name is txt first name dot text. Bigger. Last name txt last name text. Well, I got a favor to ask you guys. You ready for this?
Hey, if you're getting anything helpful out of this, a comment or even a like really helps the channel and lets people like you know this is good content. Much appreciated.
Got internal notes, and we'll say txt internal notes dot text. That should work. All right, so let's try this out here. I'm gonna save. I'm gonna run this, and this is gonna be Darren Nice. This guy is really cool. And then I'm gonna say I should I should probably do some self-deprecating humor here. This guy can't spell. Okay. And I'm gonna hit save. Oh, well, that was fast. There we go. And let's add a John Doe. And this guy is new. I'll hit save. Now we got 2 records. And if I click on John Doe, his information pops up. If I click on Darren, his information pops up. And then if I click add new, I want to, which is what I should be doing for new records. Because if I click on Darren and I want to add something, I don't want a duplicate Darren, right? So what I want to do is have a little local variable here that keeps track of if it's a new record or not. Are we in the new mode or not? So I'm going to say update context, braces, loc new record was true. Okay. But if they click on this thing over here, I'll go to the on select and I'll make sure if they click on it, that means we're not going to do a new record. We're going to say false. And then perhaps if the screen loads up, I want that to be initialized to be false. Here that is. And then also, if I save, whether it's a new or an existing record, it should always be false. Okay. And then based on that local variable, if that local variable is true, then we'll use the defaults. Otherwise, we're going to use that gallery, which is over here. I got to go click on it, get the name of it. I'm going to rename it gal user listing. I use that in the code window. I know I'm going over this fast because I've got probably 50 videos out, even here on YouTube, where I go through the patch. And I also have a 20 or 30-minute video where I go through the patch, how to do that very nice and slow and everything. So if you guys want more information about that, just do a search for Darren Nice and the word patch, and you'll find that video. Okay, so we'll do the selected on that. That will give us the record, the existing record. So the second parameter is the record that's going to be patched. So based on if it's a new record, we're going to use one of those 2. Okay, so if I go over to John Doe, I'm going to put 2 exclamation points in here, and then I'm going to go down to the bottom and hit save. And I'm going to click up on Darren and then come back and notice that those 2 exclamation points are there. That shows me that this is working. If I hit add new, I almost expected these things to be blanked out. Okay, so that needs to be fixed. So on the default, I want to do a little if statement like I did here. If it's a new record, then I want it to be blanked out. Something like that. For last name. And then the notes, very similar. That should work. Save it. I'll run it. So we have a new record. Now, notice I've got title, screen name. This needs to be redone as first name, last name. Also, these column headings. Of course, we'll need to do that. So let's say Mary Smith. And I'll just say ... Save. So now we have 3. Guys, we have just created a SQL Server application with PowerApps. Isn't that cool? And we'll continue to build on this. You guys know the requirements, what I'm going to be building, where we're going. But I hope that you guys found that really helpful.
For some reason, YouTube thinks you're going to like this video next. Let's see if they're right. Or you can select this playlist, which I've selected for you based on the content you're currently watching. Guys, gotta hurry, click one of them. Otherwise, YouTube's going to autoplay some other video.